Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Spring 2024 Sussman Lecture, Pain and Politics in the Heart of America with Dr. Jennifer Silva. My name is Matt Reed, and it's my privilege to serve as Executive Director of the Heightened Institute. I want to thank all of you for being here tonight. The Sussman Lecture Series was established by the late Richard Sussman in memory of his late wife, Lila. This gives us the opportunity to remember Mr. Sussman, who passed away in December. Born and raised in New York City, Dick was the first in his family to attend and graduate from college. A proud veteran, he served in the Korean War. Upon leaving the service, he joined a small storefront business started by his father, and along with his brother-in-law, grew it into an internationally recognized and respected corporation that was recently acquired by a large public company. Dick attended Drake on a track and field scholarship. He majored in economics and was the epitome of an engaged alumnus, generously giving of his time, talents, and resources. In multiple ways, the Sussman Theater, the Sussman Lecture Series through the Heightened Institute, and the Lila and Richard Sussman Endowment for Leadership, the Sussman name will be one of the significant names that live at Drake. I want to thank Mr. Sussman's family for allowing us to continue his legacy with the Sussman Lecture Series, which is dedicated to studying issues that define our public life and engaging students and citizens in constructive dialogue regarding these issues. As a reminder, there will be a Q&A session after the lecture. If you have a question, please text it to 515-346-8587. That number is on your programs and on the screen. We will collect the questions and pass them on to the speaker. If you'd like to post about the event on social media, which I encourage, please use the hashtag Silva@Sussman, which is on the screen. We also want to let everyone know there's an overflow space in the boardroom, that way, that will be playing a live stream of the lecture. Feel free to use that space if you'll be more comfortable or if you feel it necessary. In just a second, I'll turn it over to our undergraduate policy research assistant, Lital Cohn. We're excited to have her here to introduce tonight's speaker. Lital is a junior here at Drake studying history and secondary education. This is her third year working at the Institute, and she's been a great resource during her time here. Lital has worked on such projects as creating a guide to track bills related to disability in the Iowa legislature, and a project focused on the impact of the gender wage gap on retirement security. We are happy to have her as part of our team. To introduce our speaker, please welcome Lital Cohn.
Hi everyone, thank you all for being here. I am honored today to introduce you to Dr. Jennifer Silva. Dr. Silva is an associate professor at the O'Neill School of Public and Environmental Affairs at Indiana University. Dr. Silva earned her PhD in sociology from the University of Virginia and studied sociology at the undergraduate level at Wesley College. Dr. Silva has authored 2 books exploring American working class culture. She has also collaborated with research institutions, including Brookings and the American Enterprise Institute, bringing expertise in qualitative methods to policymakers. We are grateful that Dr. Silva took the time today to meet with Drake University students and will be delivering a lecture tonight examining the economic, social, and cultural challenges currently facing America's working class. Without any further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Silva to the stage.
Thank you, Lital, for this very kind introduction. I'm very honored today to present my research at the Heightened Institute, and I really hope to contribute to your goal of using rigorous research to promote social justice, fairness, and opportunity for all. I really want to thank Dr. Reed, not only for inviting me, but for this support of my career over the last decade. This is actually the first time we've met in person, so thank you. And also thank you to Jennifer and Catherine for helping organize. I've had a great day meeting with students and faculty, so thank you. Oh, and my 4-year-old is live streaming this in Indiana, so hello, Eleanor. I am excited to see you tomorrow afternoon. Okay, so to get to work. So I'm a sociologist, and I specialize in using qualitative methods to understand social and economic inequality. And my research relies mostly on in-depth interviews.
So sorry.
Is this not on?
Yet. No, I'm just going to adjust it so people in the back can hear you a little better.
I can yell louder too. Okay. Okay. Just tell me and I can be louder. So my work explores how people experience, make sense of, and envision solutions to economic and social inequality. And the way I like to explain it is I use qualitative methods like interviewing to try to provide insight into the numbers that we get when we look at survey data or administrative data. And so in my work, I take as a starting point that people's experience of the world, whether or not we think their perception is valid or right or true or sensible, their experience of the world can have a real impact on their actions, on mental health, and on their relationships, because people act as if it's true. And what that means is that our very well-intentioned policies could fail to reach these people and fail to appeal to people if we make assumptions about what motivates their behavior without actually talking to them. And so I see, qualitative work and quantitative work as this ongoing conversation where I want to bring people's accounts and experiences into our politics, maybe help us design better surveys, reach populations that are often left out, and also uncover new categories that we would not have known at all. So today, I'm going to talk about my book, We're Still Here, Pain and Politics in the Heart of America. And this is a book that explores how poor and working class Americans connect their everyday struggles, triumphs, hopes, and fears to politics. And so I actually began this book with an enduring puzzle, and then I'll tell you how I was wrong in lots of ways. But I began by saying, okay, for many decades we've seen stable blue-collar jobs shipped overseas. We've seen people feel like they're not able to give their children the life that they wanted to, whether it's the weakening of collective bargaining, reducing the social safety net. And it seems like for many workers, this chance to give your children a better life, the promise at the heart of the American dream, is fading away. And yet, right, when we look at survey data, rather than rise up to fight for their fair share of justice and opportunity, many of the groups in America who seem to stand to gain the most from mobilizing politically actually seem to be the least likely to vote or to act in their own self-interest. So we know that American non-voters are disproportionately younger, poorer, less educated, more racially and ethnically diverse. We know that people with lower levels of income and education are less likely to contact a public official or join an organization or donate. And even in really hard times like the Great Recession, instead of people coming together, we actually see deepening racial and ethnic divides. And this is very concerning because people with lower levels of education and income are also the same people who are concerned with fighting for basic human needs like housing and food. So without sustained political activity and without a voice, these needs go unheard. And so what I wanted to do, and I am not a political scientist, I just kind of pushed my way in. What I wanted to say is to think about, okay, instead of just saying these people are not voting in their own interests, I wanted to really dive deep into the substance of their worldviews. I wanted to understand how they arrive at their views. I wanted to hear the stories that could make politics resonate with their experiences, and try to understand how they connected their experiences to politics or not. In political polls, which are very important, we tend to isolate people from their social environment. So for example, there was an amazing political scientist, Catherine Kramer, who basically said, sure, this is great. If you do a survey, you can understand how people think or where their opinions fall on an attitude scale. But it doesn't really tell us how they get there, how they arrive at their positions. And she says it's actually the stories that people tell about who they are, about what they've been through, about how their lives maybe should have ended up. That's what helps us do this interpretive work of how they vote. So I'm today going to talk a lot about stories and about how people tell stories, about what is the right way to live. And by doing this, I'm hoping that things that seem kind of counterfactual or untrue will begin to make sense. And I want to challenge this idea that voters make choices based on policies that serve their interests, and talk a lot about identity and the emotion that people experience when deciding whether or not to vote. So the way I would put it simply is that if we want to understand why people act against their self-interest, we first have to understand how they imagine the self and how they tell that story in the larger world. So I spent about half a decade in a rural area of Pennsylvania, and I spent a few years interviewing poor and working class men and women in this old coal region of Pennsylvania. And I call my field site Coalbrook to help preserve the identities of the people who spoke with me. This is an area that really peaked after World War I, employing over 175,000 men, supporting a population of 1 million through the coal industry. But anthracite mining has fallen. It was down to 17,000 jobs in the 1960s and just 2,000 jobs in the 70s. And when you go through this area, we see mining jobs have been replaced by service jobs in education, healthcare, and retail that are largely non-union. They pay low wages, and they offer a few benefits. So these neighborhoods that once had a church and a bar on every corner now have tattoo parlors, liquor stores, and vape shops. When I was in this area, people really pride themselves on this long history of conflict between miners and mine owners. They pride themselves on union membership and loyalty to the Democratic Party. But without these values generated through work, we see a weakening of this link between labor and the Democratic Party. And in the southern counties of the coal region where I studied, politicians who advocate anti-welfare and pro-business policies have gained a lot of support. And so I wanted to know why. And so in 2015, I started attending public services, high school football games, drug addiction support groups, town meetings, volunteer fire company shifts, basically anything you can think of to try to get in. I'd go to local bus stops and start talking to people. And I'd introduce myself as an assistant professor, hoping to learn about the political beliefs and experiences of people in the coal region. At first, I was labeled the interrogator, but I slowly and painstakingly established trust with local families. And I eventually conducted about 108 interviews with people, as well as some community leaders. And so when I started, I was talking with white working class men and women. And so 67 people I spoke with had less than a 4-year college degree. They tended to work in unskilled and semi-skilled jobs that offered little control over their working conditions and schedules. And then, so in full disclosure, I thought this was going to be a book about white working class conservatives. But actually what happened, first of all, is that I had a really hard time finding people who felt strongly enough about politics to identify with a political party or advocate for specific policy platforms. So I was asking a lot of questions, and I was not really getting much interest or answers. And so, you can look at my sample. I interviewed 29 white men. 13 men reported they wanted to vote for Donald Trump. 13 said they were going to abstain from voting or write in a candidate. 3 wanted to vote for Hillary Clinton. And among the women in my sample, 22 did not plan to vote at all. 12 preferred Donald Trump, and 4 women planned to vote for Hillary Clinton. And this is a time in 2015 when many elite scholars had told me, don't write anything about Trump, it's just gonna be quick. Your book, book's gonna last a long time, and you'll be embarrassed if you focus on Trump. So, okay. So this was like the first thing where I was focusing on white working class. But the thing about sociology or social sciences is that sometimes you don't know what you're looking for until halfway you're through the data collection. This happens to me a lot. And so as I was interviewing white residents of this coal region, I kept hearing about these newcomers, so Black and Hispanic people who were moving into this rural, racially homogenous area that's actually been referred to as Alabama without the Blacks. And the white residents were complaining to me that these newcomers were destroying the fabric of the community. They were abusing welfare and public housing. And I thought, okay, I don't want to write about ethnic minorities as these moral foils, as these others. So instead, I thought, okay, well, let's see how these newcomers might be changing the racial dynamics and the politics of the coal region. So I added on 41 Black and Latino people, often also divided by gender. And this was interesting to me because the newcomers allowed me to understand diversity within the American working class. And I also wanted to understand how these newcomers confronted stigma and kind of how they were disrupting these longstanding boundaries of urban and rural and race and place. And what I learned about the newcomers was that rising housing costs, poverty and crime had pushed them out of urban economies and into this coal region. They were living in very precarious situations, working as day laborers or construction workers and shipping and receiving departments, and many were unemployed as well. And so the overwhelming majority of newcomers told me they would not vote in 2016. And so even though I thought I was going to write a book about conservatives, I ended up with thousands of pages of interview transcripts where people told me why they did not want to vote. And one person even laughed at me for wearing an I voted sticker. And so I was trying to figure out, okay, what is this book going to be about? And as I read the transcripts, I kind of moved my study away from being about voting, and it kind of moved it into a study of disengagement and alienation, kind of moved it from this ballot box into this maze of family troubles and addiction and joblessness and racism and violence and early death. This is. So just to give you an overview of the findings before I launch into some of the stories, most of the people I interviewed were fiercely critical of growing economic inequality and fiercely critical of politicians who have failed to protect them from poverty, exploitation, and shame. But the institutions that historically mediated between this personal suffering and collective struggle, so jobs and unions and marriages and networks, churches, social clubs, political parties, all of these have become weak, but also have become symbols of betrayal in their lives. And so without any of these mediating institutions, most of the people I met were cultivating these individualized strategies for making their suffering feel bearable and meaningful. Stories of pain would organize their identity, it would help them draw boundaries between deserving and undeserving, and often allow them to stitch together political views that ostensibly conflict with each other. They are convinced that democratic processes are rigged in favor of the wealthy. And so many people instead turned inward. They looked for meaning in conspiracy theories on their phones or in the self-help industry, solitary strategies that turned them against each other or only inward. And what I find is that these bridges in their mind that they create between personal suffering, distrust, and political identity often serves to justify disengagement as a safe and smart and shrewd choice. So now I'm going to jump into some of the stories of the people whom I met. So, I started off talking to white working class men, and for these men, they felt pain as this loss of social recognition and a loss of connection and solidarity with other workers. And so I'm going to tell the story of Roger, who's a 42-year-old white man, and his wife, Brenda, 41. And they live in constant pain. So I interview them in their home, and they tell me that they've been trying unsuccessfully to get medical assistance for disability for years. Him for depression, neuropathy, diabetes, congestive heart failure, obesity, her for scoliosis, hypothyroidism, and PTSD from a troubled childhood in foster care. So Roger has been out of work since 2009, and he spends his days lying on his recliner with an orange pharmacy bottle on the shelf above his head. He occasionally calls a doctor in town who is infamous for prescribing opioid painkillers. He says, yeah, if I have a cyst or something on my side or a sore, yeah, I'll go down, he'll look at it 5 minutes, maybe 10 minutes. Out the door I go, I'll just write you a script, go ahead. And Roger explains that they basically squeak by on SNAP, food stamps, and their 5-year-old daughter's Social Security insurance. And so what's interesting about Roger is that he's a registered Democrat. He's not guided by his party affiliation or by his father's voting history. But he does want to maintain his affiliation to Democrats only for his dad. He's not a conservative in the sense that he rejects government intervention. He's really proud that his dad collected 7 checks from his pensions and injuries, and Roger also voted for Barack Obama in 2008. But his criticism of Democrats right now is that they don't do enough to help people. He says, my dad was a Democrat, I'm gonna stay Democrat for him, but I'll never vote Democrat again. At one time, the Democrats helped our family. They really did. But right now, they don't do enough to create jobs, to get people back to work. I mean, I think I could have gotten me back to work with my health. Look where I'm at. I'd go back to work. I wrote Donald Trump that. I said, if you help me get my health back, I will go back to work. You can have more than my vote. I'd go work for him. I'd go be on his personal security. Just tell him to make me some kind of friggin' bionic man. And Roger sees himself and his forebearers as the backbone of America, fighting to preserve their country. And when I ask him about the American dream, He says, I think it's dying. I really do. Maybe for the refugees it's alive, but for anybody here, it's dying. He says, if I had a Confederate flag up outside, people would say it was a hate crime, but if I had a gay flag or an Islam flag, people would celebrate it. Even having an American flag is seen as a hate crime. And he's seething, so he tells me a race war is coming. It will be black against white, Hispanic against white, and we'll fight it out on the streets. And then he tells me candidly that maybe God made him disabled, just so he wouldn't be able to go out into the world and start shooting people. He tells me the government needs a totally new overhaul. Clear everybody out, start over, or just put them all down there and put one little bomb on them. He summarizes his life. I very rarely trust anyone because every time I started trusting someone, something happened. Stone Cold Steve Austin said it on wrestling, and he put it in 3 letters, DTA, don't trust anyone. And if we think about Roger here, we see how he's pitting the employment and healthcare needs of the people like him against political parties that he thinks are corrupt, against recent immigrants, and against ethnic minorities. And at the end of our conversation, which I was pretty happy, honestly, to wrap this one up, at the end of the conversation, he's like, have you ever played video games like Fallout or Fallen Earth? He says, I think these games, like on Xbox, you see how it looks like a wasteland? That's how America is gonna look soon. It's gonna be a civil war, and it's all gonna be real nasty. And he's sitting in this recliner, imagining scenes of violent annihilation, thinking about how to protect America and his body from becoming this wasteland. So I'm gonna talk about some other differences in my sample. So for the white women I spoke with, I actually heard much more about narratives of pain and trauma that happened within the family. And their stories about being distrustful of family were then spilled into larger visions of a political arena where no one can be trusted. So one of the things I find is that many of them were living amidst poverty, amidst violence, and that women kind of learned that the only way that they could get help was to embrace suffering as a means of self-growth. And so they actually frame their distrust of politics as this adaptive response to trauma. Because they say, I've been betrayed and abused so much that if I put my faith in politicians or anyone, it's too scary. So Shelley is a 33-year-old white woman, and she's the granddaughter of a coal miner. And Shelley tells me her story. Her mom was only 13 when she was born. She grew up in a trailer with her mother, her stepdad, and her 4 younger siblings. And she was sexually abused starting from age 4 and taken away from her mother. And so Shelley says when she turned 18, she got married immediately, married a boy who was enlisting in the Army, and she cut off all contact from her parents. And she said 6 years later, I got a phone call saying my mom died. Shelley explains, my mom's friend told me, your mom used to sit all day long waiting. As soon as her cell phone would go dead, she'd freak out, saying Shelley's gonna call me one day. And Shelley pauses, steeling herself against this pain with the long drag of a Newport menthol, and she says, but I never called her, I never called. And that's when I spiraled into my addiction, when I didn't care anymore. That's when life said, we're gonna catch up with you. You might have called your family out, but now you're gonna punish yourself. And I ripped my whole life apart. And she says she developed a horrific heroin addiction. And she said it wasn't until her daughter saw her crawling up the steps high on heroin that Shelley locked herself in a hotel for 5 days and started sweating and shaking and puking and crying until she had detoxed herself. She confessed everything to her husband, who then divorced her and took custody of the children. And today, she actually rarely leaves her house. She lives with her boyfriend. She doesn't work. And she says, I guess I could get disability for my PTSD and my severe anxiety. But then she launches into this very thoughtful discussion about how suffering is really what's made her who she is today. So Shelley says to me, there's a doctor on YouTube. He was talking about how he'd seen a magazine, and the article was called How Do Lobsters Grow? And it says that lobsters are soft, mushy creatures that live inside a tough, rigid shell. And what happens when the lobster starts to grow, the shell doesn't expand. The lobster does. So the lobster starts to swell and feel uncomfortable, starts to feel tight, starts to feel under stress. So the lobster goes off, sheds the shell, grows a little bit, produces a new shell, goes out into the world and deals with life. The doctor says that if lobsters had doctors, they would never grow, because the moment the lobster would start to feel uncomfortable, the lobster would go to the doctor, they'd prescribe it this, prescribe it that, and the lobster would never experience what true growth is. So the trigger for growth in a lobster is feeling uncomfortable. What's the difference for us people? If we take kids out of stressful situations and you seclude them and medicate them, you don't allow their brains to learn how to deal with anything difficult. You can't make this stuff up, right? You don't learn how to naturally cope with and deal with things that have happened. And so for her, avoiding pain is what leaves you vulnerable and unprepared for life's inevitable traumas. She says, and then they're blaming society. Why? People need to be stressed out. I'm a recovering addict, heroin addict. I didn't take medicine to get off the drug. I didn't take anything to get off the drug. I sat my happy little ass in that bedroom and I sweated it out and I suffered it out and I stressed it out. The best system for growth in life is stress. And so I try to get her to talk a little bit more about politics and to think about how this view of suffering and transforming prior mistakes into opportunities for growth might then relate to politics. So Shelley says she registered as a Democrat when she was 18, just like her parents and grandparents before her, but she actually doesn't vote at all. She's like, my family is so effed up on drugs, they live off the state, I don't want my hands anywhere near that. And so she sort of just denounces the social safety net, celebrates her pain. And she says, I'm more worried about survival than this shit show of politics. So they're totally different and distinct in her worldview. And then she offers this kind of unnerving analysis where she connects her own distrust and cynicism up to the political sphere. She says, am I going to put my life or my child's life in the hands of somebody that can't keep their story straight? I'm not. And I'm not going to put my life or my child's life in the hands of somebody that uses that much orange spray tan. And another person I talked to said to me, who'd been through similar trauma, putting your faith in one person is a lot. People have messed with my trust. One of my biggest pet peeves is saying you're going to do something and you don't do it, because so many people have done that to me. And if we think about this as policymakers, right, these women, they treat their experience of the world as if it's true, and they basically destroy the possibility of their own self-efficacy in ways that I think can have real consequences for their futures and for the economy and for democracy. And one thing to think about, as we go into Q&A is how do you reach someone like Shelley, who has embraced distrust as a way to survive? So as I kind of moved along, I eventually was able to switch from speaking to the white people who had lived for a long time in the area to the Black and Latino newcomers who had moved in. And they are part of a kind of growing diversification of rural America. And so the newcomers I spoke with told me they were coming from areas in New York or New Jersey or Pennsylvania where they grew up in poverty with extreme neighborhood violence and drug abuse. And when they got to this coal region, they felt like they might finally get a fleeting shot at opportunities that their children had never had. But as I spoke with them, they talked about facing many predatory institutions, kind of waiting to take advantage of their optimism, whether for-profit colleges that left them in debt, hostile schools and police, or landlords who knew that the blighted housing is all they could afford. And among the newcomers, they really critiqued the poverty and racism in their lives with this very sharp and unforgiving clarity. But their coping strategies also turned inward, so to conspiracy theories and self-help strategies, rather towards any collective action. I'll tell you about Adrian, a 24-year-old Black man who moved to the coal region with his mom when he was 13. He told me he was really excited to move to the coal region because he thought it would be safer and quiet, no gunshots. But soon his enthusiasm turned to dread. He said, I got suspended my first day in school, my first time ever getting in trouble in school. I used to love school before I went out there, but I got suspended because I liked rapping and I had a rap book, and I'd write my raps in it. And I guess I took it to school one day, my first day of school, and it fell out of my locker. Somebody found it, took it to the principal, and said they felt threatened. I'm like, how do you feel threatened? And he says he was constantly under surveillance by the local police. They'd come to school one day, you fit the description of an old lady getting robbed, and it was confusing. I'm like, What do you mean? What time was it? I was in school. You just got me from school. I was in school. And they're like, well, you fit the description. And so Adrian tells me he eventually drops out of school because he was stopped so often. He quickly moves into a life where he's stealing cars, buying and selling marijuana, going on joyrides late at night. And then in Pennsylvania, he ended up meeting someone who gave him some crack to sell. So he started selling crack. He actually eventually found a legal job, earning $11.75 an hour, pulling 12-hour shifts at a shipping and receiving facility. So he stopped selling drugs. He just stops. He said it was a great job. But then he says to me, before I had stopped, I had already sold to an undercover police officer. And now the first person that caught him, locked him up right away, ruined his life because he has a felony. And when I talk to him, it's only a few days since he's been out of jail. And so when I kind of talk to him about the presidential election that's coming up, he tells me clearly it just means nothing to him. He says, obviously, he knows having a Democrat in office is probably better for his own personal well-being, but he refuses to vote. He has no faith that his life could ever improve or that either political party has any of his interests in mind. He says, either way, I grew up poor, I'm still poor. Nothing gonna change for me. Either they're gonna make it better for rich people or harder for poor people. He says, everything's about money. American dream, like no racism or people not judging you, I think that's just people living in their own fantasy world. If you got money, people judge you based on your money. They look at you different depending if you got money or not. You got money, you do whatever you want. You kill somebody and beat the charge if you got money. And then he actually goes even further and summons up these conspiracies of a government determined to decimate its own citizens. And he says, I think the government is, what is it, New World Order? I think the government is gonna kill people off to control the population. They wanna control the population so you can control everything else. So you don't got that many people, or you have more government-issued officers than you do regular people. So it's easier to control. I think they're gonna try to do that. And as he hones in on this government as this secretly murderous force, the idea that he could ever have any kind of effect on politics disappears. And I want to point out here that disengaging from voting or the outside world is not just ignorance or apathy or complacency. And actually, the only time I'd really hear passion and excitement in all of the interviews I did was when people started explaining government conspiracies in politics to me. They're betrayed by institutions, they feel very detached from organizations, very distrustful of government. When they were able to talk about conspiracy theory, this is when, especially young people, their faces lit up and they got excited and wanted to prove to me that democracy was this illusion. So, how are we doing? Oh, perfect. Okay, so I could talk forever. So I want to talk a little bit about what unites all of the stories that I heard across the different histories, across the different identities. And what it is was this focus on self-protection and on personal redemption. And so everyone agrees that the world is unequal, but instead of these external or collective struggles that might be geared towards social change together, instead we hear a lot of self-help mantras about lobsters, conspiracy theories that promote individual over collective survival. And invalidating the suffering of people who need help becomes this moral choice. Pain, as they talk about it in different ways, almost becomes to them like a test of individual willpower. They don't want social safety nets to make it go away, but they want to prove that they have an identity of someone who can survive pain on their own. I would argue that this individual pain management is a necessity in this time where family and community ties have become fragile, where trust is pretty non-existent, social safety nets are limited, and opportunities for mobility in this area are scarce. If we think about what we might want to do about this, I think there is a strong case for reducing material scarcity, for improving well-being through job training and education, raising wages, housing, maybe shifting funding from police to social services. But I also want to highlight that lack of material resources is a different problem than lack of strong relationships and trust. And the disconnection and distrust that I heard also suggests there may be space for local action, not only that meets people's immediate needs, but also pulls them back into relationships and communities. Building robust public forums that might counter self-insulation, where pain and solutions might be actually shared, where people might mobilize, using their suffering. And so I wanted to kind of end by sharing the story of Ellen. And I met Ellen, a 35-year-old white bank teller, at a weekly support group she goes to cope with her anger surrounding her sister's heroin addiction. She's like, my sister, she'd just lie on the couch all day and collect food stamps and housing vouchers, and she never works. And interestingly, we're at this addiction support group. It doesn't have any official title. It's just a little sign on the basement window. There's no medical experts. It's just people in the community who have come to talk. And as people are sharing their stories, right, one mother talks about how she doesn't want her heroin-addicted son to live with her anymore. And so Ellen tells her about how he might apply for public housing. A Black working-class young woman condemns pharmaceutical companies, and she talks about doctors who basically get everyone addicted to opiate painkillers and then profit from addiction on the back end through the sale of treatments like Suboxone. They criticize the drugs-to-prison pipeline that traps their families. The system feeds off itself, she says. We have to break the system. And then Ellen brings up the example of a research study that found that rats are less likely to get addicted to heroin water if they are surrounded by toys and plenty of food. In short, if they are in rat heaven, they are less susceptible to dangerous influences. How do we make a rat heaven out of the blight of our community? They ask each other. And I bring this up as this rare moment when a sense of we emerges to confront this desperation facing the families that I spoke with, and actually did it in a way that might build community and help rather than undercut it. So perhaps it's possible that a network of trustworthy community organizers, civic, political, religious, might help people tie the pain they feel to inequalities, and perhaps learn to build this compassionate bridge between the individual and the community. But I'm hoping we can talk more about that together. Thank you. Yes, perfect.
Okay, it is working.
Here, do you want me to?
As I mentioned, there's a number to text. If you have questions, I'll read off a couple of the questions that have come in. First one, how do we get the disenfranchised people to re-engage and vote? What do you see that makes you optimistic?
No, just kidding. That's a really, really hard question, and I think I went out looking for spaces where people were engaging in politics, and I had a very hard time finding them. And I don't really have an answer for this. I'm much better at problems than solutions. But the places where I felt hope were usually in very local spaces where people would come together and try to solve problems that were facing their communities. For example, children who needed haircuts to go to elementary school and couldn't afford them. People might come together and arrange something like that. But as you get to higher levels of government, the distrust became so high that it's hard for me to imagine these top-down approaches to rebuilding trust. It's a non-answer, I know.
How can politicians and parties reach these seriously disaffected voters?
Yeah, that's such a good idea. It's a good question. Many of the people I spoke with, they stay inside their homes, they keep their doors closed, they keep their windows closed, they put their shutters down and it's dark, and they really live this life where they don't want to encounter other people, and they feel like getting involved with people will only lead to more distrust and more betrayal. And I don't think these are people who would ever be filling out a census or answering questions, so it's really hard to know much about them. I think one thing politicians might try to do is maybe speak directly to them, or maybe try to talk about the actual pain they're experiencing and try to tie it up to policies. But I think that has to happen at this local level where people actually see it and they actually believe it. Because one of the main problems is that I didn't expect to hear so much conspiracy theory. I think I've lived a very sheltered life, and then when people started talking to me about conspiracies like fluoride in the water and mind control, or 9/11 not really happening and being made up by the government, and people would talk to me in almost a condescending way, don't you know this? Like, why would you ever vote? Like, really? And I remember saying to someone like, oh yeah, I had an I voted sticker on. I was like, I should take this off, haha. And they're like, no, you should. You should take that off. Like, it's embarrassing and not smart. Like, you should really take it off. And so the thing with conspiracy theory is that just providing information, people will just think it's part of the trick or part of, the greater ruse. And so I think the one thing that stood out among the people who believed in conspiracy theory was if they knew someone in politics, they at least could observe them and possibly get to know them and get to trust them. So I do think like the face-to-face approach may have the best results here. I have a lot of faith in young people to go out and do this work.
Occupational hazard of teaching college. Given that these interviews took place before the pandemic, how do you anticipate COVID affecting political attitudes within and between these populations, if at all?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. I did the interviews kind of through 2016 and 2017, but then I actually started another project talking to people about health and healthcare experiences, but in the same region. And so I kind of stayed in the community and ended up switching to Zoom and doing like hundreds of interviews with people over Zoom. So someone would be like hiding in a closet and, talking to me, and I'd be hiding from my child also. And I don't see very much difference at all. I mean, there was a great deal of distrust of government. There was a great deal of distrust of science. But it made a lot of sense, right? If I'm talking to women about their health and all the times that doctors didn't believe them or they received poor health care and they couldn't do anything about it, they would kind of connect that to like, why would I get a vaccine? Or why would I trust the government to get us out of this? So it sort of seemed to reinforce the sense of distrust that they already felt. And, I couldn't really argue with them because they'd had these experiences that caused that distrust. And I did hear people say like, oh yeah, people like have all this money now. They might go to Burger King and buy like 10 burgers, but it's going to go away. It's not going to last. And I would be surprised. I mean, I don't know because I'm not in the field right now, but I would be very surprised if many people had decided to engage in politics post-COVID.
Did you see any role of religion or faith groups in the lives of these individuals?
The faith and religion is very interesting because in many of these small towns, life used to be really built around church. And one of the towns I was in used to have literally 12 churches, and different ethnicities would go to different churches, and they'd have all of the history of the families in them. They'd often be connected to a pub. Everyone knew everyone. And then at this point, I think there's only 1 or 2 churches left. They've all been closed. And there was like a real sense of loss of that community. And on top of that, as they've learned more about the Catholic Church and the covering up of abuse of children, there's extreme distrust, and often a sense that like priests that were known to be hurting children were even in the area. And so the faith and religion, I did not see very much of an organized religion. I even went to a Catholic Mass a few times, and it was like 3 people, and they were all maybe, 80 or not. They weren't very young. And so the spirituality I heard was very individual, a lot of kind of praying on their own or, social media, but not usually in a way that would connect them to other people. That's what I found. I think it's different in different areas, but that's what I found.
You've used the word trust a lot. How do you define trust?
That's a really good question. It's funny, I worked for a very famous political scientist who wrote all about trust, and here we are. When I think about trust, I think about a social contract or an agreement or a sense of kind of mutual obligation or reciprocity. So, trusting a politician would be kind of an expectation that they are going to serve your interests in some ways based on your vote. And then, the distrust would come from a sense that this person did not go through or did not stick to their word or actually abused the position and harmed them. So I would say I didn't start the project with a definition of trust. It was more that I kept hearing stories about, oh, I put my faith in someone, or I thought they'd help me, or their job was to help me and they failed me. And that to me that's how I talk about distrust. Kind of broken promises, I would say.
You talked briefly about people distinguishing between the deserving and the undeserving. Could you speak a little more to that?
Yeah, so people had created moral stories about who deserved help and who didn't, or you could think about it as whose pain deserves to be addressed, whose pain is valid and legitimate, and whose pain is not. So for example, the people I spoke with would say, of course, veterans should receive a pension or should receive, disability money because they've served and they've sacrificed. But they might say, if you have a child and you're not married and you're poor, like, why should I be paying you, to stay at home and raise your kids when I'm working really hard? A lot of stories about, and these took on this sort of fantastical quality, people buying crab with their crab legs or steaks with their, SNAP cards, or this idea that the poor people were all abusing the welfare while they worked really hard. And I do think it became a very strong piece of their identity. I'm a hard worker, I don't depend on the government doesn't care about me, it cares about this other group of undeserving people. Or, the government, sort of a distrust of the top and the kind of bottom. And, I think that makes them also very vulnerable politically, in a sense of, that's a really appealing way to talk about the undeserving and deserving.
When people talked about their own distrust, did they ever reflect on where it's gotten them?
I think that they're actually very proud of their distrust. I mean, the way they tell their story is that they went through many experiences of being hurt or of not thinking they were going to make it. And this could be within their own family, but it might also be in a school or a different kind of organization. And for them, kind of becoming the person they are is a story about rejecting others and about embracing self-reliance. And they did not think this had led them astray. No, they absolutely believed that if they were to open themselves up again and allow people in and work together, that something bad would happen to them. Because it's sort of the story of I've done it so many times and it never worked out for me. People would say I've broken my body for my workplace. I've given everything to my family, and what did it get me? It got me nothing. And that was a big part of their identity.
There appears to be a major focus on the federal government, specifically the executive branch and the presidency throughout these interviews. Did you find the distrust was only at this level, at all levels, or at all branches of government?
That's a really good question. So yeah, definitely distrust of presidency, distrust of Congress, kind of this idea that big companies could buy politicians' support, and sometimes it would go all the way down through the local level. Sometimes it wouldn't. But I will emphasize that people almost didn't want to spend time going through everything about politics with me. They wanted to talk about their story, about how kind of what had gone wrong and how they'd fixed it, or what they wanted for their children, or what they were angry about. And for them, those topics were not really linked to politics. And so for them, politics was okay, get that part of the interview over. I want to talk about this. And they were not linked in a way we might think they are. We might see them as linked. And some of them were I wish I had a better government class in high school. They would just say, I don't know anything, and that kind of thing too.
You had several references to distrust in traditional institutions. One of your solutions is re-engagement with community and relationships. How can we accomplish that? This is especially poignant because churches and schools and NGOs really focus on outreach to disadvantaged people.
As I said, I'm much better at problems. But that's a really good question. I mean, I think one thing you might be thinking about is, involving these very people in the, construction of knowledge about them and in the serving of them. So maybe bringing their voices in to help define what the problems are and to also create the solutions. And I think, again, that might be kind of a local level of making sure people's voices are heard, or creating spaces where different voices may come into contact. But yeah, I think getting people to engage is going to take a lot of legwork and a lot of effort in that sense. I will say most people, they care a lot about their children, and so I've often wondered whether, maybe schools of children, those might be spaces where you can pull people in, because everybody cares about their child and their school, programs like making backpacks so kids don't go hungry over the weekend. Like that was a place where people might get engaged in collective action, but not at really like higher levels than that.
How did you find your interviewees and develop rapport so they would open up to you?
Oh my gosh. Yeah, so I was like, I'm not even from Pennsylvania, so I suddenly found myself in these very small towns where everybody knew everyone, and I was very awkward, so I would just kind of like go to high school football games or go to like high school, different events and wander around and introduce myself as this, assistant professor from a nearby college. And I think honestly some people felt like bad for me, and they would start to introduce me around, like, this is Jen, like I know her, she's doing this study, and once like that happened, it helped a little bit, and people knew I wasn't a cop because there was like a lot of fear. This like terrible story is that, sociologists, we call the people we interview, we often call them our informants. That is also the same word that the police used when they were doing their heroin raids. And so I remember being like, you're my informant. And someone's like, are you trying to get me shot? Like, what are you doing? And I was like, okay, not an informant. And so like a lot of me just kind of stumbling around, but then eventually, keep showing up, keep interviewing. People would say, oh, okay, you're Ellen's friend, or okay. And then I could kind of cross into different groups. And so by now I'd been doing research for maybe, at this point, like almost a decade. So at least I have like contacts who know I'm not going to report them to the police or something, or I'm not going to call social services or whatever. But it did take, I think, it took a while to get in.
The medical community seems to be more of a detriment than a help to the problem. What could be done to improve the situation?
I could talk for a long time about this, so my most recent study is actually allows us to talk to people about their healthcare experiences, and then to also see how the electronic health records and the medical records talk about the patient. So there are many ways in which people go to the emergency room seeking relief for pain, seeking either therapy or mental health care, and are kind of told, we don't believe you're in pain, or we think you're making it up for a disability check or just to get some drugs, or basically might say, you should like stop eating so many chips and get a job, and we don't really think you're sick. And so this is the way that people experience their healthcare, and it's often kind of seen as a source of shame or not being believed and not being helped and made to feel worse. And some of the people I talked to would even try to not go back to the doctor, or they wouldn't really trust that they were in their best interest, which I think probably may lead to worse health outcomes, maybe at least for their kids. So yeah, for the medical community, I think looking really closely at these medical encounters, and if you're with someone who's in a vulnerable position, like what can you do that might connect them to social services in a way that doesn't make them feel even more vulnerable and more ashamed. It's a big question, though. It's a lot. Yeah.
One last question. What was the biggest surprise you encountered engaging in this project?
Oh my gosh, so many. I've told this to Dr. Reed, but I always get the story wrong when I go in, and then I always have like a year of collecting data where I realize how I totally got it wrong, and then I get really anxious that I'll never publish anything and lose my job, and then it kind of all comes together. So I go through this a lot. Biggest surprises, I think because I had read so much literature on this like rural white working class that was very conservative, like it was kind of illuminating just to hear how much in common everyone had, where they had this sense that politicians used to represent their interests, but that they'd been kind of corrupted by business, and that many of their heroes had sort of fallen, that they didn't know who to believe in anymore, and that they believed that like everyday people did deserve more of a chance, but were not getting it. And that really was across all of the social groups. But who they then blame for that might differ. So that was one thing that was, I think, illuminating. And this conspiracy theories really have stayed with me, because now I think about fluoride and mind control in ways I never did before. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
I hope you can all see why I was so excited to bring her here. Her first book came out in 2013. I reviewed it in Inside Higher Ed, saying it was one of the best books I'd ever read. She had a follow-up, it's about 2020, which I thought was also one of the best books I'd ever read. It's a real honor to have her here. So again, please join me in thanking Dr. Silva.
Thank you.